Myrtle Turner had never in her 24 years of life done anything that could be called reckless, which was precisely why her best friend Dolores Payne had looked her dead in the eye across the supper table in St. Louis and said, "I dare you to go to the Oklahoma Territory alone, spend 1 full month there, and come back with proof you survived it." The dare had started as a joke, the way most dares did between two young women who had grown up reading dime novels about frontier adventure and had never actually ventured farther west than the edge of Missouri. But Dolores had a way of letting silences stretch until they became something solid, something that sat on a person's chest and demanded an answer. And by the time the candles had burned low that evening, Myrtle had said, "Fine, I'll do it. And when I come back, you owe me your grandmother's pearl earrings." That had been in the spring of 1889, just weeks before Oklahoma Territory was officially opened for settlement in what everyone was already calling the Land Run. Myrtle had taken the train as far west as the rail line would carry her, then boarded a stage. And then, when the stage route ended at a dusty crossroads town called Caldwell in southern Kansas, she had done the most illogical thing a sensible woman from St. Louis could do. She had climbed onto the wagon of a family she'd met on the road, the Hargrove family, who were headed into the territory to stake their claim on 160 acres of red Oklahoma earth. She had told herself she would stay 1 month. She had promised Dolores she would write letters. She had packed 2 dresses, a good pair of boots, a small journal, and a photograph of herself to send home as proof she had indeed been there. She had not packed anything that would prepare her for Homer Monroe. The town of Clearwater Creek did not appear on most maps yet, though by the summer of 1889 it had been stubborn enough to call itself a town for nearly 3 months. It had a general store run by a man named Burl Haney, who smelled perpetually of tobacco and axle grease, a small post office that doubled as a barber shop, a livery stable, and a saloon that had been built before anything else, which told you most of what you needed to know about the priorities of the men who had settled the place. There was also a modest land office and, situated just off the main road on a slight rise that caught the evening breeze, a house that was still more lumber and intention than walls and windows, belonging to Homer Monroe. Myrtle arrived in Clearwater Creek on a Tuesday in late June, seated on the Hargrove wagon with her traveling bag in her lap, and her hat pulled low against a sun that seemed personally offended by her presence. The Hargroves dropped her at the general store with cheerful goodbyes and drove on to their claim land, leaving her standing in the street with the dust settling around her boots and absolutely no plan. She walked into the general store because it was the only thing that looked like it might have shade inside it. Burl Haney looked up from behind his counter, studied her with the frank curiosity that people in small frontier places seemed to believe was their right, and said, "You lost?" "Not especially," Myrtle said. "I am looking for a room to let. Do you know of any?" Burl scratched the side of his jaw. "Ma Strickland takes boarders sometimes. She's got a place at the east end of town, 2-story, got a red door. Can't miss it." "Thank you," Myrtle said. She set her bag on the counter and pulled out her small coin purse. "Do you carry writing paper and ink?" "Got both," Burl said. He was still watching her the way a man watches something that doesn't quite fit its surroundings, the way you might watch a parlor clock sitting out in a field. She bought the paper and ink, took directions to Ma Strickland's, and walked the length of Clearwater Creek's one main road with her head up and her shoulders square, because she was from St. Louis, and she was not going to let a dusty stretch of Oklahoma Territory make her feel small. She found the red door. Ma Strickland, who was perhaps 60 years old with white hair piled like a thundercloud on top of her head, opened it before Myrtle could knock, studied her, and said, "Young woman traveling alone?" "Yes, ma'am," Myrtle said. "From where?" "St. Louis, Missouri." "What are you doing in Clearwater Creek then?" Myrtle almost said a dare. Instead she said, "Seeing the territory for myself." Ma Strickland considered this for a moment. Then she pulled the door open wider and said, "I have a room on the 2nd floor. Window faces east so it gets the morning light. 50 cents a week, meals included. I do not tolerate drunkenness, profanity, or the keeping of livestock in the rooms." "I have none of those habits," Myrtle said honestly. "Good," Ma Strickland said. "Come in then." She was shown to a small, clean room with a narrow bed, a washstand, and the promised east-facing window. Myrtle sat on the edge of the bed and looked out at the flat, enormous sky, which was turning the color of a peach as the sun began to lower itself toward the horizon. It was beautiful in a way she hadn't expected, vast and uncomplicated in a way that made her feel simultaneously very small and very free. She wrote to Dollars that evening, "I am here. The town is roughly the size of our neighborhood block. I have a clean room and a landlady who reminds me of a schoolteacher. The sky is extraordinary. I am fine. You owe me those earrings." She met Homer Monroe the following morning. She had woken early, drawn by the light coming through the east window, and had dressed quickly and gone downstairs to find Ma Strickland already in the kitchen with coffee boiling on the iron stove. Myrtle had eaten a breakfast of cornbread and salt pork, which was not what she was accustomed to, but which she ate without complaint because she was not the complaining sort. And then she had walked out into the early morning to see the town before the heat settled in. She was standing at the edge of the road, looking at the low roll of the prairie that stretched out beyond the last buildings, when she heard a horse and turned to see a man riding in from the north. He was tall in the saddle, dressed in the practical working clothes of a man who spent his days outdoors, a dark canvas jacket over a blue shirt, worn denim trousers, and boots that had clearly been through serious use. He wore a hat with a wide brim pushed back on his head in a way that suggested he'd pushed it there out of habit, and as he came closer, she could see that he was perhaps 27 or 28, with a jaw that was dark with a few days' growth and eyes that were, even from a distance, a startling shade of brown, warm and serious at the same time. He saw her before she expected him to, and he pulled his horse to a slow walk as he came alongside her. "Morning," he said in a voice that was quieter than she'd expected from someone who looked like that. "Good morning," Myrtle said. He looked at her for a moment, not rudely but with the same frank assessment she was beginning to recognize as a territory habit. "You're new," he said. "I arrived yesterday," she said. He nodded slowly as if this confirmed something. "Homer Monroe," he said and touched the brim of his hat. "Myrtle Turner," she said because there was no reason not to. Something shifted in his expression, something too small and too quickly controlled for her to name. "You staying long?" he asked. "A month," she said. He nodded again. "Well," he said, "welcome to Clearwater Creek, Miss Turner." And he rode on toward the livery stable without another word. She watched him go and found herself thinking, for no reason she could justify to herself, that the territory was perhaps more interesting than she'd anticipated. She saw him again that afternoon in the general store. He was at Burl Haney's counter talking in low, measured tones about fence posts and wire, and he turned when she came in and acknowledged her with a nod that was serious and somehow also courteous. And she nodded back and went to look at the bolts of fabric at the far end of the store, because she needed something to occupy her hands. She was not shopping for fabric. She had no use for fabric. She was quite aware of this. She looked at the fabric anyway. Burl Haney seemed to find this quietly amusing. Homer Monroe seemed unaware of it entirely, which was, Myrtle told herself firmly, completely appropriate. She came to know the rhythms of Clearwater Creek in the way you can only come to know a small place, by being present in it day after day, by watching the same people do the same things in the same order until the patterns revealed themselves. She helped Ma Strickland with the garden in the mornings. She walked to the post office in the afternoons to post her letters to Dollars and to see if any had come back. She sat on the porch in the evenings and watched the sky go through its extraordinary color changes. She also, she could not pretend otherwise, began to notice when Homer Monroe was and was not in town. He came in every few days, and she learned from Ma Strickland, who knew everything about everyone in Clearwater Creek with the calm authority of a woman who had simply paid attention for long enough. That Homer Monroe had a cattle ranch about 4 miles north of town, that he had come to the territory in April of that year, and had staked one of the largest claims in the area, and that he worked it mostly alone, except for a hired man named Rupert who was, according to Ma Strickland, reliable in the way that a good fence post is reliable, useful, and not much for conversation. No family? Myrtle asked, keeping her voice carefully neutral. Not here, Ma Strickland said, rolling out her pie crust with expert efficiency. He came from Texas, San Marcos, I believe. His mother is there still, I think. He doesn't speak of it often. He doesn't speak of much often, Myrtle said without thinking. Ma Strickland gave her a look that was entirely too knowing for Myrtle's comfort. No, she said simply. He doesn't. The first real conversation she had with Homer Monroe happened on a Thursday in early July, at the general store again, but this time because a situation required it. Myrtle had come to post a letter and buy a few small things for Ma Strickland, and she had come out of the store to find that the leather strap of her traveling bag had split cleanly through, spilling her purchases into the road at the precise moment that Homer Monroe was passing by on horseback. He was off his horse before she'd had time to do more than stare at the scattered items, and he was gathering them from the dust with quiet efficiency, setting them back on the store's front step. "Thank you," she said, when she'd gathered herself enough to say it. She was holding the ruined bag with its broken strap and feeling, against her will, somewhat ridiculous. "Got some leather cord in my saddlebag," he said. "Could tie that off well enough to get you where you're going." "That would be very kind," she said. He retrieved a length of thin leather cord from his saddlebag and knelt in the road to thread it through the bag's hardware with the same competent focus she'd already come to associate with him. She stood watching his hands and thinking that he had the hands of a man who used them for everything, calloused and sure and not gentle in the precious way of men who'd never done a hard day's work, but gentle in the better way of a man who knew exactly how much force a thing required. "There," he said, standing. He handed the bag to her. "How long does that have before it needs a proper repair?" she asked. "Week, maybe 2, he said. "Burl Haney has new straps. I'd see to it before you head back east." "I will," she said. Then, because the morning was pleasant and she was curious and she'd been careful long enough, she said, "Do you have time for a short walk, Mr. Monroe? I've been wanting to see the creek that the town is named for, and I'm told it's just east of the main road." He looked at her for a moment, that same brief interior pause she was coming to recognize. Then he said, "I have a little time." They walked to Clearwater Creek, which was indeed a creek, narrow and surprisingly clear given the reddish color of the soil it ran through, bordered by a line of cottonwood trees whose leaves caught the light and turned it silver. She asked him about his ranch, and he answered carefully, without self-consciousness, but also without the kind of easy chattiness that some men used to fill silence. He told her he was running a small herd of longhorn cattle, building up the operation slowly, because slow was how things that lasted got built. He told her the grass out here was good, better than much of what he'd known in Texas, and that the country had a quality to it that he couldn't fully describe, but that felt to him like something he'd been looking for without knowing he was looking. "What brought you from Texas?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, watching the creek. "Wanted land that was mine," he said. "Not land I'd borrowed or rented or inherited from someone else's story. Land I started on myself." She understood this better than she expected to. "I can see that," she said. He glanced at her, a brief sidelong look. "What brought you here?" he asked, and a dare does not count as an answer. She laughed before she could stop herself, a real laugh surprised out of her. "How did you know?" "You said you were here for a month," he said, with the ghost of something that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to it. "Women who come to the territory with a purpose stay longer or shorter depending on the purpose. A month is the length of a test." "That is very perceptive," she said. "Am I wrong?" She looked at the creek and the cottonwoods and the enormous sky above them. "No," she said. My friend Dolores dared me. She said I was too careful, too contained. She said I never did anything that might turn out badly. Do you think she was right? He asked. Myrtle considered this with the honesty that she thought the question deserved. Probably, she said. Yes. He nodded. In that way he had of receiving information without needing to fill the space after it with commentary. Are you glad you came? He asked. She looked at the creek and the cottonwoods and the enormous sky and the man standing beside her who had asked the question as if he actually wanted to know the answer. I think so, she said. I'm becoming more certain of it. He walked her back to Ma Strickland's door and said goodbye in his quiet, serious way, and she went upstairs and sat by her window and wrote in her journal. I am becoming more certain that this was not just about a dare, though I am not yet certain what it is about. July in Clearwater Creek was hot in a way that St. Louis was never hot, a dry, white heat that pressed down on everything from a sky so blue it looked painted. Myrtle adapted to it with the same pragmatic attention she gave to everything, drinking more water, moving more slowly in the afternoons, wearing her lightest cotton dress and her hat whenever she was outside. She helped Ma Strickland with canning and preserving and cleaning, and in return, Ma Strickland taught her things that no one in St. Louis had ever thought to teach her: how to read the sky for weather, how to judge the ripeness of a prairie melon, how to tell a coyote's call from a dog's, how to patch clothing with a stitch that would hold. She also, in these weeks, began to be part of the town in the way that happens when you are present and willing and not pretending to be somewhere else. She helped Burl Haney's wife sort dry goods one afternoon when the woman had hurt her wrist. She sat with the Hargrove children while their mother was ill for 3 days with a summer fever. She helped the man who ran the post office organize a backlog of parcels that had arrived all at once on a freight wagon and been stacked in a corner without system or sense. She saw Homer Monroe regularly, because Clearwater Creek was small, and the overlapping circles of anyone's life there would cross inevitably and often. She saw him at the store, at the post office, at Sunday services held in the open air under a large canvas awning, because there was not yet a church building. She spoke with him regularly, easy conversations that had begun to feel necessary in a way she did not examine too closely. He was teaching her things, though he never called it teaching. He showed her how to check a harness for wear when she was hitching Ma Strickland's old mare to a small cart. He explained, one afternoon when they both happened to be at the creek at the same time, the difference between the types of grass that grew along the banks and why it mattered for cattle grazing. He told her about reading animal signs in the soft earth, what had passed, and when, which was information she had no practical use for in her life, but which she found fascinating in the way that true knowledge is always fascinating when it comes from someone who holds it genuinely. She admitted to herself one night in her journal, falling in love with him. She wrote the words and looked at them and then wrote, "This is absurd. I came here on a dare. I am going back to St. Louis. I have a life there, such as it is, which I have not examined nearly closely enough until now." She wrote below that, "He has the most extraordinary eyes." It was the 3rd week of July when Myrtle first understood something important about Homer Monroe, something below the surface of the quiet and the competence that she'd been seeing. She had gone to the general store to buy writing paper, and she had found Homer there in a tense conversation with a man she didn't know, a broad, florid man named Clearwater who had, according to Ma Strickland's thorough knowledge of local affairs, been trying for 2 months to acquire water rights to the creek that ran through the eastern edge of Homer's property. She came in quietly and stood near the fabric bolts again, not intentionally eavesdropping, but unable to entirely avoid it in a space that small. Yarrow was the kind of man whose voice was always slightly too loud for the room, and he was saying, "You're being unreasonable, Monroe. I'm offering you fair money for rights that don't do you much good anyway." "They do me considerable good," Homer said, in the quiet voice that she now recognized carried the same absolute certainty as a solid wall. "That water is on my deed and I need it for my stock." "You've got the main creek," Yarrow said. "You don't need the eastern branch too." "I have stock that graze the eastern pasture," Homer said. "The eastern branch is how they drink. I told you this last month and I'm telling you again." The answer is no. Yarrow's expression shifted into something less friendly. "You're going to find it difficult to operate around here if you make enemies unnecessarily," he said. Homer's voice did not change in the slightest. "I'm not making enemies," he said. "I'm keeping what's mine. Those are different things." Yarrow left the store with a look that Myrtle had last seen on her uncle's face when someone outplayed him at cards, a mixture of frustration and the kind of grudging respect that comes with losing to someone who didn't have to raise their voice to do it. Homer turned to Burl Haney and completed his purchase as if nothing particularly significant had happened. When he turned to leave and saw Myrtle, he stopped for a moment, and she saw in his face the briefest consideration of whether to acknowledge or to simply go, and then he said quietly, "Miss Turner." "Mr. Monroe," she said. She hesitated, then said, "For what it's worth, you handled that very well." Something in him seemed to ease fractionally. "Yarrow is persistent," he said, "but he's not actually wrong that it makes enemies. He has friends in the area." "Having friends in the area doesn't make a man right," she said. He looked at her for a moment in a way that was different from the previous ways, more direct, less guarded, as if he was seeing something he'd been looking at for a while and had only now decided to look at directly. "No," he said, "it doesn't." They walked out of the store together, and he didn't ride away immediately. They stood in the road for a few minutes in the mid-morning heat, and she asked him about his eastern pasture, and he told her about it. A stretch of grassland with a good stand of bluestem that he'd been building up slowly since April, and his voice changed slightly when he talked about the land, not warmer exactly but more alive, the way a person's voice changes when they talk about something they genuinely love. "I'd like to see it sometime," she said. "The ranch, I mean. If that's something that's done around here." "It's done," he said. "I could show you around if you'd like. Saturday maybe, if the weather holds." "Saturday would be fine," she said, and she was careful to say it the way she would say yes to any ordinary invitation, but she wrote about it that night in her journal for a rather long time. She was thinking about the dare less often than she expected. She had written to Dollars 3 more times and received 2 letters back, both full of Dollars' characteristic enthusiasm and a pointed observation in the second one, that Myrtle seemed to be writing quite a lot about the landscape, and weather and rather less about the people, which, Dollars noted, was not actually how Myrtle usually wrote, and wasn't the landscape, and weather just another way of saying something was there that she didn't want to say directly. Myrtle had folded that letter and put it in her journal, and had not written back for 4 days, which was also unusual for her. Homer came to Ma Strickland's on Saturday morning with 2 horses, a big bay gelding he rode himself, and a quiet chestnut mare that he said was good-tempered, and easy on a rider who wasn't accustomed to spending long hours in the saddle. Myrtle had ridden before. She wasn't without that skill, but she was grateful for the quiet horse because she wanted to look at things rather than manage a difficult animal. They rode north out of town in the early morning, before the heat had fully established itself, and the land opened up around them in that way that prairie land does, suddenly and completely, like a held breath released. The grass was tall enough in places to brush the horses' hocks, and it moved in long rolling waves when the wind came through it, and the sky above was the pale clear blue of very early morning, and Myrtle understood completely and suddenly why Homer Monroe had come here, and why he had no intention of leaving. He showed her the boundaries of his claim, the eastern branch of the creek with its cottonwoods and its surprising clarity, the bluestem pasture where 24 longhorns lifted their heads to watch the riders pass with the mild indifference of animals who had decided the world was unlikely to threaten them today, the site he'd staked for a barn that wasn't yet built but whose posts were already in the ground, the house, which was indeed still partly lumber and intention, but which had a solid foundation and a completed roof, and a front wall with 2 windows that looked out over the southward view, toward the distant line where the prairie met the sky. "How long before it's finished?" she asked, standing outside and looking at it. "End of summer if the weather cooperates," he said, "and if Rupert stays sober enough to be useful on the days I need him, which is not something I can guarantee." "Who is Rupert?" "My hired man," Homer said. "Good man mostly, steady when he needs to be." He paused. "He has a weakness for the saloon on Friday nights that extends into Saturday mornings." "Is he here now?" Homer nodded toward the unfinished far side of the house, where a man of perhaps 50 was methodically nailing boards with the focused competence of someone who had learned early that work was the best cure for whatever ailed you. He was short and broad-shouldered with a weathered face, and he glanced over at Myrtle with a nod that was reserved but not unfriendly. "That's Rupert," Homer said. She waved. Rupert nodded again and went back to his nailing. "He is not much for conversation," she said. "No," Homer agreed, "but he's very good with the boards." She laughed, and he looked at her when she laughed, and she caught him looking, and they both looked away at the half-finished house, and the air between them had shifted again in that way. It kept shifting, incrementally, like the light changing through a long afternoon. Homer showed her the interior of the house then, walking her through the rooms with the quiet focus of someone showing something precious. He explained what each room would be when it was finished. The main room with the stone fireplace. The kitchen with the iron stove already set in its proper place. The 2 rooms off the back of the house. He did not say what the second back room was for, and she did not ask, but she thought about it on the ride back to town, sitting the chestnut mare easily and watching the prairie roll by, and she thought that a man who built a house with a second room had reasons for doing so. "Can I ask you something?" she said when they were nearly back to the edge of town. "Yes," he said. "Why did you come to the territory specifically? There was land available in other places." He was quiet for a moment, the way he was always quiet before he said something he actually meant. "Because it was new," he said. "Because nothing here had been decided yet. Whatever I built here would be the first thing." He paused. "I suppose I liked the idea of a place where the story wasn't already written." She held that for a while, that idea of a place where the story wasn't already written, and she thought about St. Louis and its stories that were very much already written, about her life there which had been, she could see clearly from this distance, quite small despite its surface comfort, and about Dolor's dare which had been, she realized now, not really about the territory at all but about Myrtle herself, about whether she was willing to find out what she was capable of when the familiar scaffolding was removed. "I think I understand that," she said. He looked at her. "I think you do," he said. They came back to town, and he walked both horses to the livery stable and then walked her back to Ma Strickland's door, and on the porch he stopped and stood with his hat in his hands, turning it once around the brim the way men did when they were working up to something, and she waited. "Miss Turner," he said, "I know you came here for a month and that month is nearly used up, but if you found reason to stay longer, I'd be glad of it." It was perhaps the most careful, restrained declaration she had ever heard, and it was also one of the most honest, and she looked at him standing there with his hat in his hands and the evening light on his face, and she thought, well, "I think," she said just as carefully, "that I might find reason if the right sort of reason presented itself." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he put his hat back on and nodded once, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way that was absolutely a smile, brief and real and completely his own. "Good night, Miss Turner," he said. "Good night, Mr. Monroe," she said. She went upstairs and wrote to Dolor's, "I am not coming home next week. The dare is not settled yet, but I find I no longer care much about the dare. Keep the earrings. There is something here I need to understand." Dolor's wrote back 12 days later, "I knew it. Tell me everything immediately. Are you safe? Are you happy? Is he tall?" She was safe. She was, she thought, perhaps the happiest she'd been in years, though she was still sorting out the reasons for that with the careful honesty she tried to apply to herself. And yes, she wrote back to Dolor's, "He is tall." The last days of July brought a change in the weather that people in the territory took seriously in a way that people in cities did not fully appreciate. There had been dry lightning on the western horizon for 3 evenings, the kind that pulsed and flickered without rain, and the old-timers in Clearwater Creek watched it with the specific gravity of people who had seen what prairie fires could do. Burl Haney told her at the store that the previous summer a fire had come through about 20 miles west of here and taken 2 homesteads before enough men could get together to turn it. Homer had come into town on a Wednesday looking more pressed than she had ever seen him, not panicked. That was not his nature, but tightly focused in a way that was different from his usual careful calm. "Fire concern?" she asked when they met at the post office. "Nothing certain," he said. "But the grass is dry and the wind is from the west. I'm going to fire break the eastern pasture today, cut a strip back far enough to give the cattle time to move if it comes to it. Is there anything I can do?" She asked and meant it. He looked at her with a brief expression that contained, she thought, both surprise and something warmer. "Stay in town," he said. "Ma Strickland's cellar is solid if it comes to anything." "Homer," she said, and his name in her mouth was something she'd been careful about until now, and she felt the weight of it shift the air between them. "Be careful." He went still for just a moment, the way you go still when something unexpected touches you. "I will," he said. "I'll be back in town by evening." He was back by evening as promised, face wind-burned and hands dirty from the work, and when he came to Ma Strickland's door to let her know everything was fine, she felt the loosening of a tension she hadn't entirely acknowledged she'd been holding. "No fire," she said. "No fire tonight," he said. "Maybe tomorrow, or maybe the wind shifts and it doesn't come at all. That's the territory." "Come in," she said. Ma Strickland made a large pot of supper, and she made it large deliberately. He came in and ate supper at Ma Strickland's kitchen table with Myrtle and the old woman, and Ma Strickland talked about weather and prairie fires and the first summer she'd spent in Kansas Territory 20 years ago, and Homer listened with genuine interest and answered when asked, and Myrtle watched him across the table and thought that she had been right about the eyes. They were extraordinary, warm and serious and completely present, and that she was in a great deal of trouble that she was not at all sorry about. After supper, Ma Strickland found pressing reasons to be elsewhere in the house, with the transparent and affectionate strategy of a woman who had watched people fall in love many times and knew what they needed was a few minutes of not being supervised. They sat on the porch in the warm darkness, and the lightning was still on the western horizon, and the night smelled of dry grass and the faint green scent of something that might be rain eventually. "Can I tell you something?" he said, after a while. "Yes," she said. "When you first got here," he said, "I thought you were one of those women who comes to the territory to see it like it's a show and then goes home and tells people about it. Like the territory was an entertainment." "That is perhaps not entirely inaccurate," she said. "No," he agreed, "but I was wrong about the rest of it, about who you are." He paused. "You're not like that at all. You see things, you pay attention. You don't need the territory to be smaller than it is to feel comfortable in it." She thought about this for a while before she answered. "I think I came here not knowing what I was, honestly. Dollars said I was too careful, and she was right. But it wasn't really about courage, I think. It was more that I'd never been anywhere or done anything that showed me what I was actually capable of. And out here," she looked at the dark expanse of prairie and the flickering sky, "out here I found out that I'm quite capable of more than I thought." "Yes," he said, "you are." The simplicity of it, the absolute quiet certainty of it, made her breath come a little unevenly. "Homer," she said. "Myrtle," he said. And they were both quiet for another long moment, and the lightning pulsed on the western sky, and then he reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, very gently, and held it, and she let him, and they sat there in the warm dark while the territory breathed around them. He held her hand for a long time, and then he said, "I think you should know that I'm going to ask you something, but I want to do it properly, and the timing isn't right tonight." "All right," she said, with a heart that was doing something she had no name for. "But I wanted you to know," he said, "so you're not surprised." "I appreciate that," she said. "I am not easily surprised." He turned her hand over, looked at the back of it in the darkness, then looked up at her. "No," he said with that near smile. "I've noticed. The fire did not come that week. The wind shifted and the lightning moved south and Clearwater Creek breathed out and went back to its usual rhythms. But something had changed between Myrtle and Homer, and the change was visible in the way they spoke to each other and stood near each other and looked for each other in whatever room they found themselves in. Ma Strickland noticed. She said nothing explicit, but she did begin making enough coffee for two whenever Homer was likely to be in town, which was as clear a statement of her feelings as anything she might have said. Burl Haney noticed. He said, with the directness of a man who had decided to skip the diplomatic stage entirely, "You two going to get on with it, or are you going to stand around being polite until winter?" "Thank you, Burl," Myrtle said. "Just an observation," Burl said, and went back to his inventory. The Hargrove family, who had claimed their land and begun the enormous work of making a homestead out of raw prairie, invited both Myrtle and Homer to a Sunday supper in early August, along with several other people from town, and it was the first time that anyone had treated them as a pair, as two people who naturally came together, and the feeling of it was something Myrtle sat with quietly for the rest of that evening. She had not answered Doller's last letter, the one asking whether she was safe and happy and if he was tall. She wrote it that night, sitting at her window with the oil lamp burning low. "I am safe. I'm happy in a way I do not have precise words for, which is unusual for me since I generally have words for things. He is tall. He is serious and good and capable in ways I did not know I cared about until I met someone who was all three. I do not know what comes next. I think I know what I want to come next. I am terrified of it, which I believe is how you know it matters." Dolers wrote back, "Come home first. Settle the dare properly. Then decide. Don't let a dare decide your life for you, but don't let the dare prevent you from living it either." This was, Myrtle thought, the most sensible thing Dolers had ever said to her. She told Homer about it that afternoon, sitting by the creek under the cottonwoods in the green shade that was one of her favorite places in Clearwater Creek. She told him about the dare properly this time, not just the outline of it but all of it, what Dolers had said, and what she'd felt, and why she'd said yes, and what had happened to her understanding of herself in the weeks since. He listened without interruption, which was what she valued most about him as a listener, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment. "What does settling the dare mean?" he asked. "Going home," she said. "Telling Dolers I did it, claiming the pearl earrings." She paused, seeing what is actually insent. "Louis that I can't live without." "Is there anything?" he asked, and the question was careful, but she could hear the weight in it. She thought about it honestly. "My parents are there," she said. "They're not young. My brother James is there with his family. There is a life there that has obligations in it that I cannot simply walk away from." She looked at the creek. "But there is also a life there that is very small compared to what I've found I can do and be, and I cannot ignore that either." He nodded slowly. "When would you go?" he asked. "The dare was for a month," she said. "I've been here 6 weeks already. I should go soon." "And come back," he said. She looked at him then directly. "Do you want me to come back?" He looked at her with those warm, serious eyes that hid nothing even when they said little. "I told you I was going to ask you something," he said. "I meant it. I want to ask you properly when you're not on the verge of leaving. I want you to go home, settle whatever needs settling, and then I want to ask you when you come back. So you know the asking is genuine and not just me trying to keep you here before you've decided." She felt something in her chest that was warm and solid and absolutely certain. "That is," she said, "the most honest thing I've heard a man say in a very long time." "I try to be honest," he said. "You are," she said. Consistently and sometimes uncomfortably so. She smiled at him. "I like it." "Good," he said. She reached over and took his hand the way he had taken hers on the porch that night, and he looked down at their joined hands and then up at her, and she said, "I am coming back, Homer. I want you to know that, not because of what you're going to ask me, but because I know my own mind on this." He tightened his fingers around hers just slightly. "I know you do," he said. That's one of the things he stopped and she waited and he said, "I'll be here when you get back." "I know," she said. She made her arrangements to leave on the following Monday. Ma Strickland hugged her at the door in the early morning with a fiercer grip than Myrtle had expected from a small, white-haired woman and said, "Come back quick, and don't let that city talk you out of your good sense." "It won't," Myrtle promised. Burl Haney gave her a small paper sack of hard candy for the journey, which was Burl's way of expressing deep sentiment, and told her to watch herself on the stage. Homer Monroe rode with her to the edge of town, which was technically unnecessary since the freight wagon that was carrying her as far as Caldwell was leaving from the general store, but he did it anyway. He rode beside the wagon for the first mile, and then the road split and he would need to turn north to go back to his ranch, and he pulled up his bay gelding and she leaned out of the wagon to say goodbye. He looked at her in the early morning light, serious and steady in himself completely, and he said, "Myrtle." "Homer," she said. "Come back," he said. It was not a question. It was not quite a command. It was something in between, something honest and direct and very much him. "I will," she said. "I promise." She watched him from the back of the wagon until the distance and the dust made him impossible to see, and then she faced forward and thought about St. Louis and her parents and James and Dollars, and she thought about pearl earrings and dares, and the entirely unexpected things that happen when you say yes to something for the first time in your careful, contained life. St. Louis was overwhelming in a way she had not expected. Not the size of it. She'd lived her whole life there and knew its size, but the density of it, the way the buildings pressed together, and the streets were full of noise and commerce, and the urgent business of a city that did not pause to let you breathe. She had been in Clearwater Creek for 6 weeks, and she had not realized how deeply she'd adjusted to its openness and silence until she stepped off the train and the city closed around her like a hand. Her parents were well and glad to see her. Her mother hugged her and then held her at arm's length and said, "You look different," in a tone that could not decide if this was good or alarming. "I feel different," Myrtle said. "Did you eat enough out there?" her mother asked. "Those frontier towns, I worry about thee." "I ate fine, Mama," she said. "Ma Strickland is an excellent cook." Her father asked sensible questions about the territory and listened to her answers with genuine interest, because he was that kind of man, a reader and a thinker who had always taken his daughter's observations seriously. She told him about the land run and the new town and the extraordinary quality of the light in the land, and he listened and said, at the end, "You love it there." It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said, "I do." "And is there a person," he said, with the careful tact of a man who had observed his daughter for 24 years, "or is it only the land?" "There is a person," she said. "Tell me," he said. She told him about Homer Monroe, about his ranch and his house and his quiet, honest way of being in the world. She told her father about the water rights dispute and the fire concern and the conversation by the creek and the fact that Homer had said he was going to ask her something when she came back. Her father listened to all of it and then sat quietly for a moment and said, "What is his character?" "Steady," she said, without hesitation. "Honest. He works hard and he doesn't complain and he doesn't bully and he doesn't lie." She paused. "He is kind without making a production of it." Her father nodded slowly. "And you want to go back," he said. "Yes," she said. "Then go back," her father said. "We are not so old that we need you here to look after us, and your brother James is not so useless as all that." He smiled at her, a quiet, warm smile that she had known all her life. "Go and live your life, Myrtle. Don't live it in the place that's familiar when there's a better place waiting." She cried a little, which she had not expected, and her father patted her hand and did not make a fuss of it, which was very much him. She saw Dollars on her second day home. Dollars came to the house and sat across from her at the same table where the dare had been made and demanded every detail, and Myrtle gave them all without shame, and at the end Dollars said, "You're going back." "Yes," Myrtle said, "you're going back permanently." "That's what I intend to find out," Myrtle said, "though I believe so." Dollars reached into her pocket and produced the pearl earrings. She put them on the table between them. "You earned these," she said. Even if the dare was just the excuse you needed. It was the excuse I needed, Myrtle agreed. You always were the most stubborn person I knew, Dolores said fondly. You needed a dare to do the one daring thing you actually wanted to do. That is an accurate and somewhat uncomfortable observation, Myrtle said. Dolores laughed. When are you going back? As soon as I can arrange it, Myrtle said. 2 weeks at most. Can I meet him someday? I rather think you'll have to make a trip yourself for that, Myrtle said, and they both laughed, and it was the kind of laughter that two people share when the friendship is real and old and has survived everything they've thrown at it. She spent her 2 weeks in St. Louis settling things, real things, not just sentimental ones. She visited James and his wife and their 2 young children and told them she was leaving for the territory, and James said, "You've always been the brave one," which she had not known he thought, and which meant more than she could express. She helped her mother with several household tasks that had been accumulating. She gave away a number of things she owned that had no place in an Oklahoma territory life. She packed carefully and practically, with the knowledge she now had of what that life actually required: good sturdy fabric for practical clothes, basic medicines, her sewing kit, her journals, seeds her mother gave her from her kitchen garden, 2 books she couldn't leave without. She wrote to Homer Monroe, "I am coming back in 2 weeks. I have settled what needed settling, and I find that nothing in St. Louis requires me more than the territory does. I will be at the Caldwell stage stop on the 15th of September if a ride can be arranged. If not, I will find my way. I am quite capable of finding my way." His letter arrived on her last day at home as if by design. "I will be in Caldwell on the 15th. I told you I would be here when you got back. I meant it." She took the train west one more time, with her father's voice in her ear and Dolores' pearl earrings in her traveling bag, and a certainty in her chest that was better than anything she'd felt in St. Louis in 24 years of living there. The landscape changed as the train moved west, and she watched it change with a recognition that was entirely different from the watchful curiosity of her first trip. Now the grass looked familiar. Now the flat sky looked like home. He was in Caldwell on the 15th. He was standing by his bay gelding at the stage stop, taller than she'd managed to keep him in memory, which surprised her because she'd thought she'd remembered him well, with his hat pulled low against the September sun, and his hands in his pockets in the way he stood when he was waiting for something. He saw her get down from the stage, and he crossed the distance between them without hurrying but without pausing either, and he stopped in front of her and looked at her with those warm, serious eyes, and she looked back. "You came back," he said. "I said I would," she said. "You did," he said. They stood there for a moment, and she was intensely aware of how much the territory's space and air and light felt right in a way that the city had not. And she was intensely aware of him standing in front of her, and she thought that she was not a sentimental woman by nature, but that this moment was going to live in her for the rest of her life. "You said you were going to ask me something," she said. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a ring, a simple gold band with a small ruby set in it that caught the September light, and he held it between his fingers and looked at her and said, "Will you marry me, Myrtle Turner? Will you come to Clearwater Creek and build a life there with me? The house is nearly finished. The ranch is growing. And I have been more alive in the weeks since you arrived than I have been in years, and I do not want to go back to the version of alive I had before you were in it." She looked at the ring and at his face and at the wide Oklahoma sky above them and said, "Yes, Homer Monroe, I will." He put the ring on her finger and she let him, and then she put her hand on his chest and he put his arms around her, right there at the stage stop in Caldwell with the horses and the dust and the September sun on everything. And she felt his heart beating under her hand, steady and certain, and she thought, here it is, the life that wasn't already written. They were married in October. The ceremony was held in Clearwater Creek, under the same canvas awning where the Sunday services were held, because the church was still not built. The whole of the small town came. Ma Strickland wore her best dress and cried in a dignified way that she would have denied if pressed. Burl Haney stood at the back with his wife and looked quietly pleased with himself, as a man who had offered useful unsolicited advice and seen it validated. Rupert, Homer's hired man, stood beside Homer as a kind of best man and shook Homer's hand afterward with a grip that said everything Rupert was not going to say with words. Myrtle's mother and father had come from St. Louis, which had required considerable practical arrangement, but her father had said that no earthly force was keeping him from seeing his daughter married, and he had meant it. He had met Homer Monroe in the week before the wedding with the clear intention of forming his own opinion, and after a single afternoon spent at the ranch talking about land and cattle and the future of the territory, her father had come back to Ma Strickland's, where he and Myrtle's mother were staying, and said to Myrtle very simply, "Good man," and that was that. Dolers had written a letter of extraordinary length that made Myrtle laugh in 3 places and cry in one, and she had sent the pearl earrings with a note that said, "These are for the wedding. Wear them for me since I cannot be there, and you had better name a daughter after me someday." Myrtle wore the pearl earrings on her wedding day, and she thought of Dolers and the dare and the summer that had changed everything. And she stood beside Homer Monroe in front of the whole small town that had become her community and said the words that mattered. He was solemn when they exchanged their vows, solemn in the way of a man who takes serious things seriously, and he held her hands in his and looked at her with those eyes that she had described to Dolers as extraordinary and which she had not been wrong about, and he spoke his promises in his quiet, certain voice, and she believed every word because he had never said a word she didn't believe. After the ceremony there was a celebration that Clearwater Creek threw into with the enthusiasm of a place that was new and still learning its traditions. Tables set out in the street with food brought by everyone, music from a fiddle player who was not technically skilled but was enormously committed, and dancing in the road as the evening came on and the lamps were lit. Homer danced with her, which she had not expected because he struck her as not a dancing man, and he was not precisely a dancing man, but he held her close and moved with her in a way that was altogether better than dancing. They moved into the finished house that weekend. It was everything Homer had promised it would be, solid and clean, and full of the light that came through the east-facing windows in the morning and the west-facing windows in the evening. Myrtle spent the first days making it theirs, hanging the curtain she had bought in Caldwell, arranging the small things she'd brought from St. Louis on the windowsills and shelves, planting her mother's seeds in the kitchen garden on the south side of the house where the sun was good. Homer watched her do all of this with a quiet attention that was not hovering but was deeply present, and sometimes she caught him looking at her in a way that made her stop whatever she was doing and just look back. And the two of them would stand there in the house that they'd built together, or nearly together, and the feeling of it was better than anything the dime novels had ever managed to describe. The first winter in the territory was hard, as first winters in the territory tend to be, with a cold that came off the plains like something with a purpose and snow that arrived in November and stayed until March. But the house was well built, and the fireplace threw good heat, and Homer had prepared for it, with enough wood stacked and enough food stored and enough practical competence to see them through the worst of it without crisis. They were snowed in for 5 days in January, which would have been terrible in different company, and was instead, Myrtle would tell Dolers in a letter the following spring, one of the best stretches of days in her life. They read to each other in the evenings by firelight. She had her 2 books and he had 3 more she hadn't known about, a quality she found in him that kept surprising her, the depth of what he had read and thought about and carried quietly inside him. They talked for hours, the kind of talking that you can only do when you are snowed in together, and the world has given you the unusual gift of complete stillness. She learned things about him that she hadn't known, about his childhood in San Marcos and his father who had died when Homer was 15, and how that had made him into the man who wanted land of his own, because owning land was one of the ways a man could protect his family from the kind of loss that came when you were dependent on someone else's goodwill. "You've been protecting against that loss all along," she said. "Yes," he said. "I suppose I have." "And now you have the land," she said. He looked at her across the firelight. "And now I have you," he said, "which is considerably more than I planned on." "Is that a good thing?" she asked, though she knew the answer. "Myrtle," he said, with a patient warmth that made her smile, "it is the best thing." She was not a woman who blushed easily. She considered it a vestige of the overwrought sensibility that dime novels promoted, but she felt something in her face that she suspected was close to a blush, and she turned back to her book with a dignity that was somewhat undermined by the fact that she was smiling at the page. The Cleat Yarrow problem resolved itself in the winter, not dramatically but decisively. Yarrow, after months of various attempts to pressure or negotiate or maneuver around Homer's refusal to sell the water rights to the eastern branch of the creek, had overreached himself in a dispute with another settler, and found himself with legal trouble that occupied his attention entirely. He left the Clearwater Creek area in February, his claim acquired by another family, and the eastern branch of the creek ran clear and uncontested on Homer Monroe's deed, and Homer mentioned it on a cold February evening with the kind of simple satisfaction of a man who has held a line and been proved right to hold it. "I told you he didn't have a case," Myrtle said. "You did," Homer agreed. "And yet you handled it entirely on your own," she said. "You handled the part of it that was handled in the store that day," he said. "You said something that made it easier to hold on." "What did I say?" she asked. "That having friends in the area doesn't make a man right," he said. "I've been telling myself the same thing, but it helped to hear it from someone else." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. They did this a great deal. The casual, constant touching of people who have found in each other a comfort so genuine that they return to it without thinking, the way you return to warmth. Spring came to the territory like it always came there, fast and green and full of itself, the grass coming up in a wave that moved across the prairie from south to north, and turned the world back to life in what felt like a matter of days. Myrtle's kitchen garden came up with an abundance that she found deeply satisfying in the specific way that things you planted yourself and tended and watched over are satisfying, as if growth is always a little bit personal. Homer expanded his herd that spring, buying 20 more cattle from a rancher coming through from Texas, and the ranch was now a real operation with a credible future, the kind of thing that could grow and sustain and become something permanent. He and Rupert spent long days out on the range, and she managed the household and the garden with the same competent practicality that had surprised her in herself the previous summer. And she found that she was not lonely in the way she had vaguely feared she might be, because the work itself was absorbing, and the land was absorbing, and the evenings were hers and Homer's. She wrote to her parents regularly, and her father wrote back letters full of questions about the territory and the cattle business that she read to Homer in the evenings. And Homer answered them seriously, with the respect he had for her father who had asked the right questions before the wedding. She wrote to dolers who wrote back with the news of St. Louis, which Myrtle received with the fond but distant interest of someone who has moved fully from one life into another and does not regret the move. She was happy in a way that she had come to understand was not the simple happiness of having what you wanted, which she had always thought happiness would feel like, but the deeper and more complicated happiness of being fully present in your own life, of doing the work that your hands were actually meant for, and loving the person who saw you completely. In the early summer of 1890, about a year after she had first ridden into Clearwater Creek on the Hargrove wagon with her bag in her lap and no plan, Myrtle Turner Monroe realized she was expecting a child. She told Homer on a June evening sitting on the front porch of the finished house, watching the sun go down over the prairie in its extravagant western way, and she told him simply and directly because that was how they were with each other. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she looked at him to see his face, and she found something there that she had only seen in glimpses before, unguarded and deep and entirely uncontrolled, a joy so large that it seemed to require a moment to contain itself. Then he reached over and took her hand in that way that had started the night on the porch when everything was different and was now simply the way they were, and he held it and he said, "Are you well? Are you feeling all right?" "I am very well," she said. "A little tired in the mornings, otherwise completely fine." "Good," he said. He pressed her hand to his chest over his heart. "Good." She rested her head against his shoulder and they watched the sun go down, and the prairie turned gold and then red and then purple in that enormous sky. And she thought about the dare and the stage and the morning she had stood at the edge of town looking at the flat roll of the prairie, and the man who had ridden past on his bay horse and said good morning in a voice that was quieter than she'd expected. She had come here on a dare. She had found a man worth staying for before the dare was even settled. And the life that had grown up from those two facts was more than she had known to hope for. Their son was born in February of 1891, in the middle of a cold snap that turned the prairie white and still, in the house that Homer had built with his own hands on the land he had claimed from an open territory. They named him James after Myrtle's brother, and he was loud and healthy and had his father's eyes from almost the first day, the warm and serious eyes that had started everything. And Homer held him with the hands that were calloused and sure and gentle in the best way, and Myrtle watched them from the bed where she lay recovering and thought, once more and finally and for good, that she had been right to come back. Ma Strickland came to the house the following morning to help, because Ma Strickland was that kind of woman, and she held the baby and looked at Myrtle and said, with the brevity that was her nature, "Good." "Yes," Myrtle agreed. Burl Haney sent over a side of smoked pork and a jar of his wife's best preserves, which was Burl's language for everything warm he felt. Rupert came to the door on the third day, turned his hat around twice in his hands and said, "Congratulations to you and Monroe," and then walked back to the barn, which was Rupert's language for everything. Homer sat beside her bed on the evening of the third day when the baby was sleeping and the house was quiet and the cold outside was pressing against the windows, and he took her hand and she could feel in the way he held it that he was full of something too big for the quiet room. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" she asked. "For coming back," he said. "For choosing this, for choosing me." She turned her hand in his and laced her fingers with his fingers. "Thank you," she said, "for being worth coming back to." He looked at her with those eyes for a long, full moment, and she looked back, and between them was everything. The dare and the stage and the creek and the cottonwoods and the lightning on the western horizon, and the ring at the stage stop, and the snow and the firelight and the kitchen garden and the boy sleeping in the next room with his father's eyes. "I love you," she said, because she had said it before, but it was always true, and it was true right now with a particular force that she did not want to leave unstated. "I love you," he said, "more than I know how to say adequately." "You say it adequately," she said. "You always have." He smiled, the real smile that she had watched develop from its cautious beginnings into something full and entirely his own, and she thought that of all the things the territory had given her, and it had given her many, this was the one she would not trade for anything in the world. The years settled into Clearwater Creek the way good things settle, not all at once but gradually, each season bringing its own specific richness. The town grew, as towns in the territory grew, not always gracefully but persistently. A proper church was built in 1891, white-painted with a bell that rang on Sunday mornings and could be heard for a considerable distance on a still day. A schoolhouse followed in 1892, and Myrtle involved herself in its establishment with the organized determination that she brought to anything she decided mattered, recruiting a teacher from Kansas City, helping raise the money for books and a proper blackboard, ensuring that the children of the settlement had a real education available to them. She had opinions about the schoolhouse that were not always shared by everyone on the town committee, and she expressed them without apology, because she had come to understand that the careful, contained version of herself that Dolores had challenged was not actually her nature but a habit she'd grown up in, and out here, where there was no precedent to defer to and the story wasn't already written. She was fully and entirely herself. Homer watched this with deep satisfaction and supported her in every practical way he could, which was considerable, and occasionally reminded her, with a gentle humor that had developed between them over the years, that not everyone thought as quickly as she did, and that patience was sometimes the more efficient tool. "You are not always wrong about that," she told him. "I know," he said, in the mild way that meant he was pleased. Homer Monroe's ranch continued to grow. By 1893, he was running a herd of nearly 200 cattle and had hired a second man, a young cowboy named Billy Cass, who was 20 years old and eager and not yet competent, but had the quality of paying attention that Homer valued above all else. He trained Billy the way he did everything, methodically and without wasted effort. And by the end of Billy's first year on the ranch, the young man was solid and reliable and said, with the embarrassed sincerity of the young, that Homer Monroe was the best boss he'd ever worked for, which Homer received without visible sentiment but which Myrtle could tell meant something. She became, in those years, a person of standing in Clearwater Creek, not because she sought it but because she showed up consistently and worked hard and could be trusted, which were the things that built standing in a small place. She helped at the church, at the school, with the various community crises that a young town produces as it finds its footing. She delivered more than one neighbor woman's baby when the doctor could not arrive in time, because she had learned from Ma Strickland and from the simple necessity of being in a place that did not have surplus professional help, and she was competent at it. She kept her garden every year and her kitchen was generous to anyone who needed it, because Ma Strickland had shown her that generosity with food was a kind of language that everyone understood. She wrote to her parents faithfully, and they visited twice, her father each time spending as much time at the ranch with Homer as he spent at the house with Myrtle, which she found entirely right and satisfying. Her father and her husband had developed, over the course of letters and visits, a genuine mutual respect that she thought was one of the quiet good things in her life. Her mother adapted to the territory visits with a resilience that Myrtle had always suspected was there and was glad to see confirmed. "It's very large," her mother said of the sky and the prairie together on her first visit. "It is," Myrtle agreed. "I see why you stayed," her mother said, "though I wish it were closer to the train." "The rail line is coming," Myrtle said. "They say within 2 years." Her mother patted her hand. "In the meantime," she said, "the stage will have to do." James Monroe grew into himself in the way of children who are loved and known, with confidence and curiosity, and the particular fearlessness of a child, who has never had reason to doubt that the world is fundamentally safe. He rode by the time he was 3, on a small patient pony that Homer selected with the same care he applied to everything, and by 5 he was following his father around the ranch with a focused attention that made Homer's eyes do something Myrtle had learned to recognize as the deepest kind of happiness. "He has your way of watching things," she told Homer. "He has your way of asking about them," Homer said. In the spring of 1894, their daughter Clara was born, and she was, from the first hour, a person with opinions, which Myrtle found deeply encouraging. Clara had Myrtle's coloring and her own entirely particular temperament, and she attached herself to the kitchen garden from the age at which she could toddle out to it, and she attached herself to her brother from the same age, following James with an adoration that James bore with the tolerant dignity of an older sibling, who has decided that a small sister is acceptable even if she does get underfoot. Dolores came to visit in the summer of 1894. Finally, after 5 years of letters and the arrival of photographs, and the growing body of evidence that Myrtle Turner Monroe was genuinely, specifically, entirely happy. She came on the stage from Caldwell and stepped into Clearwater Creek with the expression of someone who has been reading about a place for so long that the reality of it is slightly surreal, and she stood in the street and looked around at the town and the sky and the flat roll of the prairie and said, "Oh, I see." "You see what?" Myrtle asked. "I see why the letters all sound like you," Dolores said. "Incent. Louis, you always sounded a little like someone else's idea of yourself. Out here you just sound like you." Myrtle hugged her friend and felt the full, warm weight of knowing she was seen by the person who had known her longest. "Come to the house," she said. "Come and meet Homer properly." Homer was, of course, exactly as Myrtle had described him, and Dolores told him so at the dinner table on the first evening with the cheerful directness that was her nature, and Homer received this with the mild good humor that had always been his response to the unexpected. "She described you very accurately," Dolores said. "Serious, honest, good. I should say she left out the tall, which she mentioned in a letter but did not include in the official description." "Dolores," Myrtle said. "I'm just being thorough," Dolores said. Homer looked at his wife with that particular expression she knew best, the warm, quiet one that was entirely for her, and said, "She tends to understate things she cares about." "She does," Dolores agreed. "Always has." "I am right here," Myrtle said. "We know," they both said, nearly together, and then looked at each other with the surprised acknowledgement of two people who have just discovered an unexpected alliance, and Myrtle gave up being dignified and laughed. Dolores stayed 2 weeks and went home to St. Louis with the kind of changed expression that comes from 2 weeks in open country after a lifetime in a city, and she wrote Myrtle from the train, "I understand everything now. I am keeping the pearl earrings you never asked me to give back, but you might want a pair that isn't already spoken for." Ma Strickland, who had been part of Clearwater Creek longer than most, and who Myrtle had come to love with the specific devotion you develop for people who were kind to you when you were new and uncertain, died peacefully in the winter of 1895 at the age of 66. She died in her own house with the red door, in her own bed, and she had been clear-headed and comfortable until the end, and the town that had gathered around her over the years gathered around her now, in the way of people who understand they are losing something irreplaceable. Myrtle sat with her in the last 2 days, and Ma Strickland, in the way of very old people who have something to say and not much time to say it, told her things she would carry always, that she had been glad to see her come back, that Homer Monroe was the best kind of man, that the territory needed women with good sense and good hearts, and she had both. She said it with her characteristic brevity and her characteristic certainty, and then she said, "You'll do fine," in a tone that was both permission and prediction, and Myrtle had squeezed her hand and said, "Because of people like you," and meant it. The town mourned her with the real grief of genuine loss and carried on, as places must, because the territory did not pause for grief any more than it paused for anything else. Myrtle planted a rose bush in the kitchen garden that spring, a climbing rose of the deep red kind that Ma Strickland had kept in a pot on her porch, and she tended it every year after, and it bloomed extravagantly each June, and she thought of the old woman every time. The years moved. The rail line came, as predicted, in 1896, and the town grew noticeably faster after that, which was good for the business of the territory, and complicated in the way that all growth is complicated, bringing new people and new ideas and the occasional new tension. Clearwater Creek navigated it mostly well because it had a generation of people who had built it from nothing and understood what it had taken and were not careless with it. Homer Monroe's ranch was, by the late 1890s, one of the most established operations in the area. He had built it carefully and slowly, and it had the quality of things built that way, a solidity and a depth that the quickly built and quickly grown things did not have. He employed 4 men now, including Billy Cass, who was fully grown and capable, and had become something between an employee and a friend in the way that happens when you hire someone young and watch them become who they are going to be. The herd was healthy and the land was managed well, and Homer was, in his quiet way, proud of it, though he would not have used the word proud. Myrtle was proud enough for both of them and said so, which made him give her the look. James at 8 was the kind of boy who asked why about everything, which his father answered with the patient thoroughness that had always been Homer's way, and which Myrtle answered with the slightly more expansive approach of someone who had grown up with books, and believed that the best answer was sometimes the one that led to 3 more questions. Clara at 4 was already demonstrably herself, with a will that she expressed without apology and a laugh that filled the house when she produced it, which was often. It was Homer who started the tradition, though he would not have called it a tradition, of sitting on the porch on summer evenings with a glass of cold water and watching the sky go through its colors. He had always done it since the first summer, and she had joined him, and the children had grown into it, until it was simply what the Monroe family did in the evenings in the summer, sat together and watched the extraordinary show the territory put on every sunset as if it had an agreement to always exceed itself. "You're happy," she told him, one evening in the late summer of 1898, watching the sky turn from gold to deep orange to the first purple of coming night. "I am," he said, with the simple certainty of someone who has examined the question and found the answer clear. "What would you have done?" she asked, with the comfortable curiosity of a person who has been with someone long enough to ask without worry, "if I hadn't come back?" He was quiet for a moment. "Kept working," he said, "kept building." He paused. "But it would have been a smaller life. A good life, but a smaller one." He looked at her. "I knew it the week you left. The size of the thing I was hoping for." She leaned against his shoulder, the way she had for nearly a decade now, in the posture of a woman who has found her particular place in the world and is entirely at peace with it. "I knew it before I left," she said. "I knew it was the right thing to go, but I knew I was coming back. I knew it clearly." "Good thing," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "Considerable good fortune all around." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head with a tenderness that had never diminished in all the years, and she felt it the way she always felt it, with the particular warmth of something that has been given freely and consistently and without condition. James wandered out onto the porch and leaned against his father's other side, looking at the sky. Clara came tumbling out after him and climbed into Myrtle's lap without invitation or apology, because Clara never needed an invitation for anything she wanted, and settled herself there with the boneless comfort of a child who knows she is entirely welcome. They sat together, the 4 of them, and watched the last light go out of the sky over the territory, the sky that Myrtle had first seen from a boarding-house window 6 years ago and had thought was extraordinary, and which she still thought was extraordinary because it was. The dare had been a month. She had stayed a life. And the life was more than she had known to ask for, more than any dime novel had managed to describe, and more than adequate for what her father had wished for her, standing in their St. Louis house telling her to go and not live her life in the place that was familiar. She had not lived a familiar life. She had lived hers. The town of Clearwater Creek continued to grow into itself, and the Monroe Ranch continued to grow into itself. And in the winter of 1900, when the new century turned over like a fresh page, Homer stood at the window of the house he had built with his hands and looked out at the snow-covered land and said, "New century." "New century," Myrtle agreed, standing beside him. "We've been here 11 years, he said. "You have," she said. "I've been here 10. "Best 10 years, he said. She took his hand and he took hers, and they stood at the window together looking at the white land under the enormous sky. And she thought about dares and decisions, and the extraordinary luck of having a friend who knew you well enough to dare you toward your own life, and the extraordinary fortune of a territory that had been new and unwritten when she arrived, and the extraordinary gift of a man who was steady and good and capable in hers. The dare had been settled long ago. The month had stretched into years. And standing at the window of her own house on the land she had helped build on the first day of a new century, with her husband's hand in hers and the sound of their children sleeping in the rooms behind her, Myrtle Turner Monroe thought that some dares were not dares at all. Some dares were just life asking you if you were ready. And she had been ready, and the life had come. Outside, the Oklahoma Territory lay white and still and enormous under a sky that went on forever. And somewhere in the distance, a coyote called once and was answered by silence. And the snow fell gently on the house and the barn, and the pastures where in the spring the cattle would graze again in the deep grass. And the Monroe family was home, entirely and completely home, and all the threads of the long, improbable story of how they got there were gathered now and held and closed. The dare kept, and the earrings won, and the man found, and the life built, and the love grown into something so solid and so full that it would still be standing when the century ended, and the children were old, and the ranch had become a legend in the county about the man who came from Texas, and the woman who came from St. Louis, and the territory that gave them both more than either of them had known to want. She pressed close to Homer in the cold by the window, and he wrapped an arm around her, and they looked at the new century's first snow. And Myrtle Turner Monroe, who had come to the territory on a dare and found a man worth staying for before the dare was even settled, felt in every part of herself the warm and certain knowledge that this was exactly where she was supposed to be. And it was.